Hi, I'm Dr. Lichnak, and welcome to Bio 1221, Anatomy and Physiology for Medical Imaging. I'll be leading this class this semester. Hopefully, we'll give you a lot of information to help you prepare yourself for entering into the X-ray Tech program. Okay, I think probably the best way to start and best place to start in any type of course is right at the beginning. Lay a little bit of foundation, and what we want to do is we want to talk a little about why anatomy and physiology. First of all, what anatomy and physiology is, but even probably more importantly, why does this relate to you? Why is this important to you as you plan to head into an X-ray tech type of a career? And hopefully, not only will you gain the information, but you'll gain the appreciation and the understanding of why these things are critical to be able to understand. One of the things that I think is that we try to stress during the course of the semester is not really to learn to pass an exam, but learn for retention by reviewing things over and over and over again. Everything we tell you is going to be important, not everything you're going to remember, but hopefully there'll be a lot at the end that you'll say, that makes sense, because what happens, the beauty I think about anatomy and physiology is what happens is when we start to blend these two things together, things make sense. It's solving a mystery and solving a problem, and everything comes together. And all of a sudden, you say, "Wow! Now I understand why that's like that." And it has a relationship to how things appear in space within the body, as well as how they function. So let's just give you a little bit of an idea about what you should expect during the course of the semester. First of all, I think the best place to do is, first of all, what is anatomy? Anatomy, tomi, as a suffix, means to cut, cutting things up. And basically, anatomy is basically the science of body structures and their relationships amongst other structures, where one thing fits in that little nook and cranny and where that thing fits in that nook and cranny. And a lot of this has been, this information that we have about anatomy has come along by years and years and years and years and centuries of what we call dissection. The word sectioning or section means to cut things into parts or pieces. Okay, when things are sectioned, you take a section here, you take a section here, and basically that's what we have in regards to anatomy. If you look at some of Da Vinci's early drawings, they were remarkably accurate. Well, how did he get those drawings? He just didn't all of a sudden dream it one night. Basically, it was by dissecting cadavers, which was sort of a dicey thing to do at that time because cadavers weren't easy to find. We go to some of the English medical schools that basically relied upon cadavers to come to them for dissection by, of all people, grave robbers. Anyway, we'll talk a little about that probably in our second discussion. But anatomy has a big influence on what we talk about during the course of the semester because the anatomy really shows the relationship of one structure to another, which is quite important. Physiology is a little bit different. Not do we just know where things are, but we know why things are there and how they work. And that's what physiologist tells us. Physiology, basically, physio means nature and logi means the study of something. And this is the science of how the body functions, how one thing works with another. And what we're going to find, and hopefully this is going to amaze you by the end of the semester, is how everything works together. When when you used to watch the A-Team, and the one guy used to say, "I love it when a plan comes together." Well, I love when a plan comes together. And that's why I love anatomy and physiology, because all of a sudden things start to work together. Okay, and that's the whole function and the whole basis of why we're doing this, is these are intertwined disciplines, and structure allows performance to occur the way it does. The way things are set up allows things to function the way they do, and hopefully you get that appreciation as the course goes on and understand what this intimate relationship between structure and function are. They both rely upon each other immensely. Well, just to start out, we're going to be talking about all these different levels during the course of the semester. We're going to be talking about chemical levels, we're going to be talking about cellular levels, tissue levels, organ levels, system levels, and the whole body as a whole level, because you can't just look at one without the other. So we're going to be talking about each of these different sections. So let's first talk a little bit about what's the chemical level. Well, basically, if you look around at your neighbors and your friends and people within your house over the past month or whatever the case may be, just look around and they all look different. But you know what? On the deepest fundamental level, basically they're all the same. They're all made up of atoms. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, sodium, potassium, magnesium, down the road. We're all basically a hodgepodge of all these atoms that are in our body that work in certain ways. And we're going to be talking about a lot of these. We're going to be talking a lot about oxygen. We're going to be talking a lot about hydrogen. We're going to be talking a lot about sodium. Sodium is going to drive you nuts. Potassium is going to also drive you nuts. Also things like calcium. Calcium is really important, and people have a lot of misconceptions about calcium. Okay, we'll talk about that when we get to the osseous section. Okay, but what happens is the atoms are the smallest unit of matter. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a second, and how X-ray involves atoms. It does. We also have molecules. Molecules are basically, by definition, a combination of atoms. We take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, put it together, and we have a molecule. You know, we have really simple molecules like water, H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Or we have carbon dioxide, CO2, 1 part carbon, 2 parts oxygen. And they mix and mingle, and they create this structure that has a purpose. And we'll talk a lot about water. We'll talk a lot about carbon dioxide. We'll talk a lot about oxygen. Oxygen actually occurs more naturally as a paired O2 as compared to just oxygen. Okay, we have a little bit more complex molecules such as glucose, C6H12O6, which is interesting because what happens is when the body uses C6H12O6, 6 parts of carbon, 12 parts of hydrogen, and 6 parts of oxygen, when it's done with it, you know what we have? Carbon dioxide and water. We have CO2 and H2O. It gets boiled down to some simpler molecules, carbon dioxide and water. Okay. Then we have, other molecules, proteins. Our body is full of proteins. Proteins are quite complex molecules. There are all kinds of molecules that are folded and on top of each other and bound together and wrapped all up in with high energy bond strings that will keep things together. And then we have the mother of all mothers, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the genetic material or the structure of life. It's a very complex, but in some ways a very beautiful structure. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. We'll be spending a lot of time on DNA and RNA and what DNA and RNA really is. We'll talk a little bit about it today, but we'll also talk about a lot more about it later on. Well, let's first mention a couple things about atoms so we understand what an atom really is. An atom consists of protons, which are positively charged particles, electrons, which are negatively charged particles, which are around the outside, and possibly neutrons, okay? And neutrons are in everything except possibly hydrogen. Hydrogen has 1 proton, 1 electron, and no neutrons, okay? Neutrons are also in the nucleus. In the nucleus of a molecule we have, so if I look at the nucleus, which, let me go ahead and get this thing up. The nucleus, this area right here, we're talking about a conglomeration of protons and neutrons in the nucleus. It actually gives the atom weight, okay? So the nucleus has protons and neutrons which give that atom some particular weight. Around the outside of the atom, we have electrons, okay? And the electrons basically rotate around in shells in different directions. They have orbits that go around the nucleus, and they'll rotate around in shells. First shell usually has 2 electrons, then we have 8 the next one, and so on, down in multiple shells as the rows go down, okay? So these electrons rotate and revolve and orbit around that nucleus, okay? And they have a negative charge where the protons had a positive charge. These electrons have a negative charge. In molecules, they're stable. The number of protons, positively charged particles, equals the number of electrons, negatively charged particles. So if we look at a hydrogen, hydrogen has 1 proton, 1 electron. Okay. If I look at oxygen, oxygen has 8 protons, 8 electrons. Also going to have some neutrons too. Neutrons may be equal, more or less than the number of protons. They could have multiple different formations of what we have there. They could be equal, more or less than the number of protons. This gets me to a couple definitions that I should probably mention at this point. And the first definition I have is the atomic number. Okay, so if you hear something saying the atomic number just means the number of protons. The number of protons. So, if we're looking at something, this is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, this is 8, this is an oxygen. Okay, so what happens is that inside that nucleus, there are going to be 8 protons. Okay, so hydrogen has 1, so its atomic number is 1. Oxygen is 8. Oxygen is 8. Sodium has 11. Its atomic number is 11. Okay, that's the first definition. The second definition I have is what's called the atomic weight. The atomic weight. And the atomic weight is basically the number of protons plus the number of neutrons, the thing that give weight. Electrons are so small they don't give much weight at all, but protons and neutrons are large and they do give weight. Okay, so the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in the nucleus would be what we call the atomic weight. Okay, what happens is these are also called elements. If I look at this, all these are called elements. An element is the simplest atomic structure that can't be broken down any further. Okay, and that's what we call an element. So basically that's what we see with atoms. Atoms, again, protons, neutrons, electrons, protons and neutrons in the nucleus, electrons in orbits that revolve around that. Okay, and this is going to come important in a couple things. Now this is basically just looking at lithium. Okay, lithium, its atomic number would be 3. Okay, why? I have 3 protons, 1, 2, 3, and that means I have the equal number of electrons, 3 electrons. It has more neutrons, it has 4 neutrons, but the number of neutrons could be equal to, more, or less than the number of protons in the nucleus. Okay, it has 4 neutrons, but it has 3 electrons and 3 protons. Okay, so that would be that. Now molecules are a little bit different, because molecules are combinations of elements. It's not just an element or an atom, but a combination of those things. So they're called compounds. Okay, compounds and molecules, they're basically the same thing. Okay, now the thing that's interesting about them, they have to be held together by what we call bonds. Bonds are certain unions or junctions that are created between 2 atoms to hold them together, just like gorilla glue or something like that, holding 2 things together. Now bonds are not all the same. There are different types of bonds. Okay, one type of bond we get is called a covalent bond. A covalent bond is between what they call 2 non-metallic atoms. If you look at the periodic table, some are metals, some are not metals. Is between 2 non-metallic atoms where they share a pair of electrons equally. They share a pair of electrons equally. So what happens is the 2 atoms have the same needs. So this guy says, hey, you have one of those, you have those I could share that makes me more stable. And he says, you know what, you're right, you have 2 that I could share that makes me more stable. So basically they share these they share these electrons equally. Okay, now if I look at the shells, like I mentioned, the first electron shell usually has 2 electrons, but if it has 1, it wants to gain another one or lose 1. Okay, it can't lose 1 because that would be hydrogen. Okay, and it has to have an electron somewhere. But let's my second shell wants to have 8, and usually these electrons revolve around in pairs. Okay, so but it wants to have 8. So let's say I have 2 with 6. Okay, in that outer shell, and another one with 6 in the outer shell. Say, hey, you know what? If you share 2 of yours and I share 2 of mine, we each have 8 in our shell, which makes us more stable. Okay, and that's what oxygen does. That's why oxygen exists, not as oxygen by itself, because that outer shell would have 6 when it wants to go to 8. But if I take and share 2 between each of those, you share 2, you share 2. Now each outer shell has 8, and it binds them together, which makes it much more stable. That's why oxygen exists as O2 and not O. Okay, so that's called a covalent bond. The other type of bond that we get, okay, is called an ionic bond. An ionic bond is basically a bond between a metal and a non-metallic atom that have opposite needs. One has too many for a shell, and one has too few for a shell. So the idea is the one that has too many says, hey, listen, you know what? I'm going to loan you this one to make your shell more stable, but we have to make this make it a union to make this happen. Okay, so one has too many to be stable and one has too few to be stable. So therefore what they do is they mutually get together to combine, and therefore now they become stable. Let me give you a couple examples of what I'm talking about. Okay, now this is oxygen. Okay, now if I look at oxygen, let's look at the bottom one. The bottom one's probably easier to see. The oxygen is the atomic number of oxygen is what? Remember, atomic number of oxygen is 8. Okay, so let's count these purple ones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now I mentioned, here's my inner shell. My inner shell has 2, it's stable, but my outer shell has 6. It would like to go to 8, and then by 8 it fills that shell, which makes it stable. Okay, let's look at the oxygen over here. My green oxygen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, we have 8, but 2 of them are inner shell and 6 in the outer. What does that outer shell want? The outer shell would like 8. So what does it do? It combines this outer shell. So what happens? I have 2 green from this 2 purple from that. Now they have 8 in that outer shell because they mutually share 2 with each other. And that instead of oxygen existing as O, exists as O2, because now I have 2 oxygen. They're united by the sharing, equal sharing of those 4 electrons. 2 from one oxygen atom and 2 from the other oxygen atom. Now we have what's called a covalent bond. Okay, and you see that in the same image on the top. Okay, but hopefully that's understandable to you. Again, my second shell wants to be stable to have 8 if it can. Has 6, which is okay, it's livable and stuff like that. Yeah, but it'd be nice to have 8. Okay, has 2 on the inner shell. Inner shell is perfectly satisfied. 6 on the outer shell. I'd like to get to 8. So what happens is there's 2 oxygens. They say, I'll loan you 2 of yours if you loan me 2 of yours, and we can share those. So all of a sudden now we have 8 in the outer shell, and now it's a happy union, and that's a covalent bond. Okay, and that works well. Now an ionic bond is a little bit different. Okay, now this is sodium and chloride. Okay, or chlorine. What happens is if I look at these two, okay, when we look at chlorine, it has 17 electrons, you know, and so here's 2. There's another the 8. My second ring is okay, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ooh, 7. You know, it needs that other one. Okay, it only has 7 in the outer shell. It wants what? 8. Well, let's look at this. If we look at my sodium, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 11, but has 1 in the outer shell, which means it's too much. It says, you know what? I'd be more stable with this shell right here and not worry about that one. And this one says, well, you know what? I could use and fill my outer shell with that extra electron. So what do? They combine that electron. What does that do? That combines the sodium and the chloride, and it creates what we call NaCl equals salt. Okay, and that's what we call an ionic bond, where the sodium is willing to donate 1 electron to the chloride, who needs 1 to become stable, and therefore what they permanently become united. In, you know, the justice of the peace brings them together, and now they're united and creates NaCl, which is much more stable than sodium by itself or chlorine. Okay, so basically that's what we see with what's called an ionic bond. Now, again, I said probably the molecule of all molecules is DNA. We're going to be spending a lot of time on DNA and what DNA really does. People have a lot of misconceptions about what DNA is. They really don't understand it. We're going to fill in a few of those blanks today in this little video, but we're going to spend a lot more time talking about DNA and how actually DNA really works in about a week, okay, down the road. Okay, and when we look at DNA, basically it's a complex but exceptionally simple molecule because it only has 3 parts to it. Okay, the 3 parts are a sugar group. Okay, if we look at that, let me just do this here. We have a sugar group. Okay, and that sugar group, you know, makes a backbone. Okay, and then what happens? So I have a sugar group right here. Whoops, that right there. There's a sugar group. A sugar group and another sugar group. It's this right there. Okay, and then what happens is that sugar group is bound together with phosphate. Okay, so it creates a phosphate bond, which is this area right in here. That's a phosphate group. That's a phosphate group, and this would be bound to the next one over, and that creates a backbone to it. And that's this backbone that we're seeing down here. This backbone here creates a backbone here. Creates a backbone here, which creates what's called a double helix. The third part. So now we know we have a sugar, which is there. Which don't look at this word base yet. That's not going to make a difference. That'll come down in here. But we have the sugar right in here. Have the sugar here. We have the sugar here. We have the phosphate that holds it together in this long string. Well, what really binds one strand to the other strand are these things in here. And these are called my nitrogenous bases. Now in DNA, I only have 4 nitrogenous bases, only 4 things to remember, only 4. I have adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Why are they called nitrogenous base? Because they have nitrogen in them. They have nitrogen in them, okay? And they are bases, okay? So they have a lot of nitrogen in them. So we have adenine and thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Now the good thing about this is basically when I look at this double helix, okay, this double-stranded sugar that's coming down together, what happens is this is what you need to remember in DNA. Adenine always binds with thymine. And let's look up here. Adenine, they have it listed as a blue, and they have thymine sort of like this yellowish orange. Every time I see a blue, what's opposite? A thymine. And they bind together with simple hydrogen bonds between the two. Simple hydrogen bonds. Guanine always is going to bind with cytosine. So therefore, if I look down here, green and red, basically there's a green and red. So what I have is I have these double strand of sugars that are held together with phosphate bonds, and they're in like a twirl, like a spiral staircase. And what the rungs of that staircase are these nitrogenous bases: adenine binding to thymine, and guanine binding to cytosine. Now here's the key. The key is what order do they bind? Okay, and we'll be talking about that. I want you to think about that, and that's going to come up in when we talk about a lot more in detail about DNA, what order they bind. Okay, and they'll look at these in triplets. Each 3 means something. Okay, well, what happens is once I get the adenine and the thymine, they actually bond together by what we call a hydrogen bond. Okay, so if I'm looking at this, we started out with a sugar phosphate background up in the upper left. We added these nitrogenous bases to it, and I have to get the 2 strands together, and the 2 strands together by creating a hydrogen bond between the 2 strands, between the adenine and the thymine and the cytosine and the guanine, and that holds it together. Now instead of having 1 strand with nitrogenous bases, I have 2 strands that are held together by the bases with a hydrogen bond between them. Okay, and that is DNA. That's how DNA is made. Now the order of the nitrogenous bases, the adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine, is where it's all at. That's all the secret. That's all the big stuff that's going to become a little bit later. But basically, that's the chemical structure of DNA. It's a sugar base. It's held together with phosphate bonds, which I see in my upper blue bracket, and binding those 2 strands, which creates a sugar strand or a backbone. Okay, and those are joined together by adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine bases, with the adenine always binding to thymine, the guanine always binding to cytosine, held together by nitrogen bonds. And that's the simplicity of what DNA really is. Okay, again, it's a lot more complex than that, but we'll get to that later on. Well, what really is DNA? You know, everybody says, well, it's my eye color or my hair color or whatever the case may be. And yeah, I suppose in a little way it is, okay? But our DNA has a lot more than that. It has what's called our genetic code, okay? And what happens is with binding of these bases, it actually has a code for, and get this, ready for this, now clear your mind, think about this. It has the code for how to make protein. And there are different types of proteins. So every code, it's the cookbook, the Betty Crocker cookbook of how to make all the proteins that my body needs. Okay, so it has all these proteins that are stored in memory in this DNA by the way these base pairs line up on these double strands of sugar. Okay, and that's what it is. What happens is I get these very long strands of DNA, okay, and then they wind them up like they look like ramen, you know. They wind them up, and they actually wind up into like an X. The center is called a centromere, and part of it comes one way and part of it comes the other way. So I have one leg. I'll have one leg of the. Let me just draw it this way. I have one leg coming this. Well, this is not a good picture. It's a good color. I have one leg coming like this, okay, and then I'll have another leg coming like this, and they join together in the middle right here at what's called the centromere. Okay, and basically that's what we have. And these things are called chromosomes. I have 23 pairs of chromosomes, okay? And these 23 pairs of chromosomes are in one place in our cell. They're in our nucleus of our cell. Each cell has a nucleus, with the exception of maybe red blood cells and a couple other odd exceptions. Cells have a nucleus. Inside that nucleus of every cell in our body, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And those chromosomes have a code that says, this is me. Okay, it's unique for every individual, unless of course you have an identical twin. If you have an identical twin, guess what? They have your chromosomes too. Okay, but what happens is along these chromosomes, okay, at little parts all the way along the chromosomes, little spots all over the chromosomes, are little special areas, and these little special areas are called genes. Now the gene could be only a couple segments long, or it could be really long, depends upon what it's coding for. And these genes are the specific areas on the chromosomes that have that cookbook genetic information as to how to make all these proteins in my body. Okay, and that's what those genes are. It's interesting. A number of years ago, they did what was called the Genome Project. The Genome Project actually was trying to take and make a map of all the chromosomes, of all the 23 pairs of chromosomes. And what happens, they're trying to make a map. And what they're doing is they're trying to identify where each gene is on each chromosome, which worked out pretty well, okay? What they found was, and this was the interesting thing about chromosomes, they found out that the majority of the material in my DNA, you know what it meant? Nothing. It was zero. It had no significant code. There was nothing that it coded for, okay? So they just said, oh, geez, what's going? And some people actually think it might have been old viruses that incorporate. This is getting off the track, but now, especially with all this COVID stuff, what is a virus? A virus is a piece of DNA or RNA, and what the piece of DNA RNA is enclosed in a capsule, and the body takes it in one way or the other, whether it's by inhalation, injection, whatever the case may be. This piece of DNA or RNA that's in a capsule gets in the body. Once it gets in the body, that capsule releases the piece of DNA, and the DNA migrates and gets in the area of my nucleus of the cells and incorporates itself somewhere in my chromosomes. And when it incorporates it somewhere in my chromosomes, it has the code for making the protein from more DNA and RNA. And therefore it replicates itself. That's why we can't kill it. It gets incorporated in all our cells, and it was never alive to start out with, so we can't kill something that was never alive. Okay, but that's just a little bit of byproduct of what we're talking about. But what happens is these areas along the chromosomes that have this genetic information, by the way that these base pairs are lined up, are called genes. Okay, and we have tons and tons of genes. And in fact, what we find is a lot of the diseases that we have, when they look at that, they realize that a lot of these diseases have a relationship to an abnormal protein, muscular dystrophy. In muscular dystrophy, there's a certain protein that should be made in one of the chromosomes on the Y chromosome, the 23rd pair of chromosomes on the Y chromosome, because it only occurs in males. Okay, there's a certain type Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and what they find out is that the code was somehow altered in that DNA sequence, in that sequence of nucleotides, the nucleic bases, the nitrogenous bases. They find out that that code was somehow altered. Therefore, because it was altered, it makes the wrong protein. It makes a protein that's like it, but it's not the right protein. It doesn't work. As a result, that frequently results in what we call disease. Okay, and that's where we're at with that. So that's DNA. If I go, and we've seen this before. This is a slide we talked about before, simple things. But I do have something, warning, warning, warning. The significance of what we've talked about so far in regards to Bio 1221 and medical imaging is X-rays produce effects on the atomic level. We all have X-rays at some point. We've been exposed to X-rays, and what happens is these X-rays that we get on our atomic level may cause changes in our DNA, and as a result, because of that, they cause changes in our cells, the cellular environment, and stuff like that, which may actually produce detrimental effects on the body, depending upon how much radiation we are exposed to. We'll talk more about this later. And that's the significance we have. That what happens is X-ray is not totally innocuous. As the X-ray passes through the body, what it does is it changes these atoms in a certain way I'll talk about in a minute, and that causes these atoms to change in such a way that may affect the chemical structure of our cells, which may then affect the genetic or the DNA structure of our cells, which, if that is the case, may result in certain changes or abnormal proteins being made or no protein being made when it should be made, or all kinds of different things, which then result in things such as disease. And that's one of the things that X-ray may have a problem with. Let me just mention a couple things about X-ray. X-rays are actually particles. They're X-ray photons. Photons have mass and they have weight. And what happens is when an X-ray is emitted out of, I mean, you've probably all had an X-ray at some point. If you haven't, you probably haven't been alive very long. What happens is these X-rays, you can't see them. They're invisible rays, but they do have particles, these photons. As the photons hit the body, they pass through the body. And as they pass through the body, because these particles and these photons are very small, what they do is they strike electrons and knock electrons off the shells that we were talking about before. Electrons then become liberated from the atoms. In other words, they just get shot off. It's like taking a pool ball and just hitting and all the balls going in different directions. It knocks these electrons out. Okay. As a result, I can't do much with the nucleus. The nucleus is held together because those protons are held together in a tight bunch with what? Neutrons. Protons and neutrons held together in a tight bunch. So as a result, electrons have what type of charge? Negative. Protons have what type of charge? Positive. Therefore, if I take some of that negative charge away from an atom by shooting it out, by getting it hit by some type of a X-ray photon, that atom becomes positively charged. So the atom becomes positively charged because I've lost some electrons, 1, 2 more electrons, because of the X-ray hitting them and scattering these electrons. And these are called free radicals. You've probably heard of free radicals. You maybe if you're a health nut, you've heard people talk about free radicals. What free radicals do is they may cause damage to DNA. Okay, they create an environment that may damage the DNA. Okay, these atoms become ionized because again they're now positive. If something is neutral, it's not an ion, but if it's positively or negatively charged, it's called an ion. Okay, now they become positively ionized, and as a result, what happens is the body does a couple things to those ionized atoms. Number one, the atoms in the cell may be destroyed. Okay, they just may be eliminated. Okay, the cellular cells may repair themselves. Okay, or the cells may say, you know what, I could live with this, but I don't know what's going to happen down the road, and it creates mutations. So when atoms hit when X-rays hit the atoms, displace the electrons, the atoms become positively charged or free radicals. It causes changes to the cells in the DNA. The DNA says, I'm going to do this differently now. The cells will say, you know what? No, you're not. Get rid of them. Wipes them out. Sends out the hitman to take away that particular cell. Or says, you know what? You're not beyond repair, and it will actually send certain materials to the cell so the cell can repair itself and get back on track. Or it just lets it go and creates mutations. One of the things we're talking about a lot in cancer now is that what happens is when we have a cancer cell, we starts out with one cell mutates and we have a bad cell. And this bad cell wants to make more of its friends to be able to make a larger tumor. Well, what happens is the body has a surveillance system that's actually able to look around for these abnormal cell divisions, abnormal cells that have been damaged either by X-ray or by, who knows, things that we breathe in, chemicals that we take in our body, foods maybe, all these things that may cause a change in the cell. And what happens is the body has this surveillance system that sends these surveillance substances around to look for these cells all the time, every day, look for these cells that are actually functioning crazy. They're not working right. And what happens is the surveillance system has an option. Do I fix it? Do I kill it? Or do I leave it by itself and let it go and see what happens? And again, what we find is, in many cases, that in cancer, somehow our surveillance system that looks for destroying, repairing, isn't there. And these mutations continue to exist, and these abnormal cell divisions, the cell perpetuates another abnormal cell, which perpetuates another abnormal cell, which perpetuates another abnormal cell, and all of a sudden I have a tumor. Okay, so basically this is all important. And to be truthful with you, yes, X-ray has been known to produce cancer, probably for this reason. Okay, so what happens next? It all begins with X-rays affecting atoms. If atoms are affected, what else does it affect? It affects molecules. Because what are molecules? Molecules are basically, multiple atoms put together. So now all of a sudden, if I have a bad atom, one bad apple will spoil the rest of the bad apples and creates bad molecules. What bad molecules do is they make bad cells, or the cells don't function quite right. What does this do? Well, cells are in larger structures called tissues. Now the tissues are affected. And tissues make up what? Organs. Now the organs don't work like they're supposed to, and organs are part of a system. Now that system has a malfunction, and then all of a sudden the whole body is involved. So what we're trying to say here in this very short little discussion here is that all biological damage that we have with X-ray begins with the consequences of radiation affecting the atom to start out with. By knocking that electron off its shell, like we talked about, creating an unstable atom, and as a result, now I have a positively charged atom, which is a free radical that causes other changes to occur, and next thing you know, one thing leads to the next. That's why what happens is people who are X-ray techs are always still going to have they wear a badge that monitors the amount of radiation they're exposed to, and above a certain area, they know that that radiation can be quite harmful. That's why pregnant females should not get X-rays. Why? Because it may affect rapidly dividing cells in an embryo and fetus that may cause various problems down the road. Okay, so that's what we see with that. Now, so then we've talked. So now we've talked about the atomic level, which is basically what the X-ray is affecting first. Okay, one level up from that we have the cellular level. And what is a cell? A cell is the basic structural and functional unit of the body. It's alive, with the exception of a couple types of cells, okay, that really don't have a whole lot to say, okay? But cells are basically the basic structural and functional unit of the body. We'll be talking, after we get through this first section, we'll be talking a lot about cells and cell structure. They're the smallest natural living units in the body. They are alive. They actually are their own ecosystem, all in one, okay? And what we find out is when we look at the body, and you're going to see this in labs and stuff like that, that there are a number of variations. Smooth muscle cells, nerve cells, epithelial cells, cardiac muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells, all kinds of different types of cells that all have different purposes, okay? This right here would be actually looking at a bunch of cells. All those little darker purple things are basically the nuclei of cells that are lined up. So those are all similar cells. They're all lined up, and basically, you know, that could be, whatever tissue that might be. So warning, same warning here, folks. The atoms, because they're affected, may affect the DNA, which may affect the cells. What happens is we go up one level from that. And we go up one level and we're at the tissue level. Now a tissue is basically a group of cells all working and performing together for a particular function. We have a bunch of different types of tissue, epithelial tissues. Epithelial means, epi means upon. Epithelial tissues are cells that are tissues that are coverings or linings. So the skin is an epithelial tissue because it's covering my body. All the inside of my mouth, down my esophagus, down through the intestines, those are all epithelial tissues because they line the inside of a structure. On the outside, if I opened up my belly and looked at the outside of all my intestines and everything, there's also a membrane on the outside, which is also epithelial tissue. Connective tissue is, guess what connective tissue does? It connects, okay? Bones are connective tissue, ligaments are connective tissue, fat's a connective tissue, tendons are connective tissue, fibrous tissue is connective tissue. Actually, blood is also considered a connective tissue as well. So we have connective tissue. We have muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is basically made so that what happens is the muscle can contract, can get shorter, and by doing that, it makes motion. So that's a different type of tissue. Nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is built to be able to conduct an impulse. Okay, some of the nerves that we have that go from our brain to wherever my big toe might be multiple feet long. I mean, they're microscopic in width, but they could be multiple feet long. So nervous tissue. So these are different types of tissues, and you see, like different type. These where you see these little circular things or ovoid things, those are all columnar cells and creating a tissue which is a lining. That's an epithelial tissue. Okay. If cells are involved by radiation, again, tissues must be involved as well. Okay. We're just going up. Next, we get to organs. Okay, now organ is where I have a bunch of different tissues that are put together. Okay, in other words, if I look at an organ, there'll be multiple different tissues that are all working together for some common purpose. Okay, most of these organs have some type of a reproducible shape. If you looked up at the thing right up at the top, you'd say, oh, even if it didn't say stomach there, you'd know that was a stomach because that's what the stomach would look like. Heart. Everybody says, if I was to draw a picture of a heart, I would think everybody draw a picture of a heart. A brain. Everybody draws a picture of a brain. So I have a reproducible shape. There are some variations and stuff like that. But what happens is in each of those tissues, I have each of those organs, I have a bunch of different types of tissues that are put together for a common function or common purpose. Okay, so the stomach has an outer epithelial tissue. So if I looked at the outside of the stomach, there'd be epithelial on the outside as well as on the inside. And then we have connective tissue that holds the layers together. Plus I have bands, at least 4 different bands or 4 different layers of muscle in the middle. So basically, I have multiple different tissues that are all working together for a purpose. Okay. So if I looked at here, this is actually a stomach that's been removed. This is fatty tissue on the outside. But here's the stomach. You know, if I was to draw a picture of where the stomach is this area right in here. And basically, we'd look at that's and this whole area is the stomach in here, and that would be incorporating a number of different types of tissues. Okay, so as X-ray may affect an atom, it may affect cells, it may affect tissues, and guess what? Duh, if tissues are involved, so therefore organs are involved as well with radiation. They will cause a change. Finally, we get to the system. System means I have a bunch of organs that work together as a common function, such as the GI system. GI system involves the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, as well as things like the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, and even a little bit with the spleen. Okay, so they all work together for a common purpose. Okay, and what we find is some organs in one system may also contribute to another system. You know, if I look at the kidneys. You know, the kidneys are involved with relieving the body of extra waste, which is basically by the urination, but also is involved in things such as red blood cell production and blood pressure control. So it affects the cardiovascular system and affects the hematological system. So some organs may be involved in multiple different systems. But when we look at a system is basically a group of organs that have a common purpose. Okay, and there are a number of different systems. We'll be talking about most of these systems as the course goes on. Okay, this is just looking inside the abdomen, a cadaver abdomen. So we see the liver. This would be the liver up here. Here's the gallbladder sitting right here. Here's the stomach. You see right there. This area right here, coming around this way, it comes down this way and up this way and down like that. That'd be the large intestine, and this is all the small intestine in here. So you see all that stuff in there. So that's basically part of the gastrointestinal system. Do I need to say more about how the systems may be involved if by radiation? All the way up the chain. Okay. And finally, I take this all together, everything we've talked about thus far, and put it all together, and I have a living organism. You know, we have a living individual, which is a sum of all parts. And if I take that individual, I could break it down to systems, but I could go further down into organs, and I could go further down into tissues, and I could go further down into cells. If I took cells from this kid and put it in that body, what happens? The cells would look the same. They would look very similar to being the same. You couldn't tell one person from the other. Why? Because the cells are the same. And many of the organs would look the same. The tissues would look the same. The only thing that looks different on the outside. So basically what happens is the body is this combination of multiple different hierarchies of structure. Atoms, or the chemical portion, to cells, to tissues, to organs, to systems, to result in an individual. Okay, and that's what this class is going to talk about. We're going to go into every little part. We're going to be talking a lot of atoms. We're going to be talking about what happens when a muscle contracts, rushing in of sodium, rushing out of potassium, rushing through of calcium. All the things are happening on a chemical level. Then we're going to be talking about what happens to the cell itself. How does the cell contract? Fibers that will actually start to interdigitate. Why? Because of the interaction of the chemicals, the atoms are inside. And what does that do? That causes that organ to change in shape. And that causes movement, and it affects the body. So we go up this hierarchy. All that we're going to be talking about all semester, every time we talk about, we're going to be talking about physiology and anatomy on every single one of those levels. Chemical, cellular, tissue, organ, system, and how it affects the whole body. Because the body likes to be the same. The body, even though we look different, the body likes to be the same. And that's what we call homeostasis, which is what we're going to be talking about in the next little video. Okay, so hopefully what you've realized now is that we're a lot more than we look like from the outside. We're a lot the same inside. Chemically, we're the same. If I was to go around, and you were in class, okay, and if I was to go around and take blood from everybody and looked at the blood findings from everybody, guess what? Your blood findings would be really, really close to everybody. Why? Because everybody's about the same chemically. There's not that much different. If I was to take tissue out of everybody, or look at someone's individual cells and look at tissues, they would look the same. If I was to take somebody's stomach and say, okay, for extra credit, bring me in your stomach and pop it on, don't do that, please. What happens is then what happened, it looked a bunch of stomachs, they look the same. But the thing about it is when I put this all together, I have an organism, and even though we look different on the outside, we're very much the same. And that's what brings anatomy and physiology together, because deep down inside, we all run the same way. We're all on the same clock. We're all on the same mechanisms. We all work very similar to what the person next to you does. The person across the table of you from you at dinner. You know, the guy that's parking the car out in the parking lot. They're all the same, basically on all these levels. And that's the beauty of physiology, because if I could understand what happens in you, I could understand physiologically and anatomically what happens in you, all the way down the road, because we all function about the same. That's the beauty of anatomy and physiology, because I love it when a plan comes together. Everything finally comes together in the end, and everything, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense. So hopefully this is going to be some information for you as a start. Either right now you're saying, geez, forget this, I don't want to do this anymore, okay? Or you're saying, yeah, let's do this. Yeah, this is good. I want to know more about this. And hopefully if you stick with this, what you're going to find is that there's going to be a lot of really good stuff that's going to come up, okay? And I'll talk to you a little bit later with the next video. And in the meantime, be safe.